Working with your parts can feel like an uphill battle. Journaling, talking to parts, following trailheads, it can be downright exhausting. Center, the app, is here to help. Center supports IFS practicing individuals worldwide who want to deepen their connection with their inner system and access more self energy. It simplifies the journey of inner exploration with intuitive tools to foster relationships with your parts and access more self. With guided meditations from leading IFS voices and a supportive community of like minded explorers. Download Center, the IFS companion app built by a small team driven by a big shared why that everyone deserves to thrive. Get Center for iOS or Android and start your journey to greater self leadership today. Welcome to Season 6 of the One Inside an Internal Family Systems podcast. I'm Tammy Salenberger, author of The One Inside 30 Days to Your Authentic Self. This podcast is for anyone curious about their inner world and who have a desire to connect to that authentic self. Welcome. I'm so glad you're here. I am super excited today to introduce Ralph De La Rosa. He has been personally mentored by Dick Schwartz for about a year and a half. He's been practicing meditation since 1996. He's taught meditation since 2008. He is a PTSD survivor and someone who has struggled with depression and opiate addiction survivor. And we are here to talk about his third book, which I love this title. It's called Outshining Trauma. Ralph was so sweet to send me this book, and I absolutely love it. It's so good. I took so many notes, and I have a million questions. I know we're not going to get to all my questions. So Ralph, let's start where we always start, which is where you are in the world and what do you see out your nearest window?
Hi. Strangely enough, I'm in Seattle, Washington, and what I see out my window is a rainbow-colored crosswalk on Pike Street, where I live, just kind of in the district, in what used to be the gay district of Seattle. And so I live above and I kind of moved here after the pandemic, after the stark silence and isolation of the pandemic, to be around people living life really loudly, and specifically queer people living life really, really loudly. So yeah, I kind of live on the Bourbon Street of Seattle, if you will.
Oh, really? But it's not that anymore? Like, was it that at one point and now it's not?
It's just more of a mixed population here than it once was. It's more integrated now than it once was. Yeah.
Gotcha. So Bourbon Street sounds really fun. I lived in New Orleans for a couple of years, but it's really just disgusting because like people drink those like hurricane things and they throw up. Like you don't really want to live there. It's just like smelly and gross.
Yeah, I'm at a point where I don't really want to live here either. I've had enough, but I spent COVID in the mountains, like just totally alone and just working and holding space for folks. And so I needed the contrast after all of that.
So where are you off to next?
That's a very good question. I don't know. Maybe New York City, maybe back to Mexico. We'll see. We'll see how things start to play out in our world since we're at this deeply pivotal moment.
Yeah, so Ralph and I are meeting the week of the election. So the election results just came in yesterday. It feels like that was 5 weeks ago for some reason. But so that is definitely weighing on lots of people's systems, lots of people's parts.
Indeed. It certainly is mine. And Dick Schwartz had a really great email today as well,
Yeah.
just talking about like go find your parts. Go
Mm.
find your parts right now and put them in the sunlight of self. And he said something really interesting too that I'll just say while we're in this moment. He also said he was discovering that his parts weren't actually holding big burdens. They just needed to be held. A lot of them just needed to be held in awareness.
Mm.
It's so nice and fortunate when we find that all our parts actually need is to be included and seen and heard in the sunlight of self, and they shift, right?
Mm. That's
As opposed,
beautiful.
yeah.
Go ahead. What are you going to say?
I was going to say, as opposed to the parts that do hold burdens, that it's a much more time intensive and painstaking process with. Yeah.
Yeah. So, your book is called Outshining Trauma, A New Vision of Radical Self Compassion. I was going to say comparison. That's not right. Self-compassion. And you integrate IFS with Buddhist meditation. And one of the things that you said, which I thought was really funny, because you have a really funny sense of humor when you write, you said Buddha wasn't the dude's name. That's what you said. And you said the Buddha is one who is awake. And you talk about the womb of awakening and that that's the primary objective of self energy. So, can you talk about that? What you just said that Dick sent this email out and you talk about awakening. And so I want to sort of tie that into what you talk about when you talk about Buddhism.
Yeah, so I was really steeped in Mahayana Buddhism when IFS found me. And what I was struck by right away was the one-to-one correlation, frankly, of what's called Buddha nature in Buddhism and the reality, the direct experience of self-energy, which IFS gave me somehow access to that space inside more readily than Buddhism ever did. I think Buddhism was a fantastic setup, but in terms of actually experiencing capital S self directly and learning how to apply that, most importantly in our lives, IFS gave me a really fantastic training in doing that within my meditation practice that Buddhism had given me. And so the correlation is just very interesting if we look through the lens of reparenting ourselves, which is really what being in touch with self energy inside will start to do for us, kind of almost on its own. It starts doing that. It starts holding space for the wounds. We get insights and ideas about, the ways in which different maybe disciplines need to be updated in our lives or negative beliefs rooted out. Right. So self energy as a reparenting force. And then we go over to the Sanskrit that gets translated as Buddha nature, which is Tathagata Garbha, which doesn't translate as Buddha nature. It translates as the womb of awakening. And so right there we have the caregiver
Mm,
correlation, right?
mm, mhm.
Within this realm of reparenting ourselves. And that's just one of the many, many parallels that really just lit me up right away when I crossed paths with IFS.
I love that. And I love the idea of my parts being held in the womb of self, like the womb of self energy or the womb of awakened me. Um, and the idea that I've been thinking about this a lot is the idea of that is reparenting all on its own. Like this reparenting and these do-overs, we'll talk about do-overs in IFS. That happens just when I turn towards my parts, just when I let them talk, just when I let them tell me what they need, this
Mhm.
reparenting is happening. It almost feels like it's happening from the very beginning. My parts are having a very different experience, from me than they did from my caregivers.
I mean, the womb metaphor also tracks in terms of, this is a place where they get to mature. It's a place of nurturing,
Mm,
maturation, and individuation. And but also, I'll say this: one thing that's helped me understand and internalize the model at an instinctive level, quite frankly, is parts are just like people
mm,
in every way. Why? Because they're us and we're people. But if you treat your parts just like people, you get kind of the same responses you would get from anyone else in that situation. And who doesn't relax, soften up, find themselves more open to healthy suggestions when they feel seen and heard? Yeah. Approach anybody with compassion and their presentation will change to you. Same thing inside.
yeah, that's beautiful. So tell me about Dick writes your forward, and it sounds like you guys have a really special relationship, which I loved, and I loved the forward. And he really highlights two things that I thought were really interesting, and I'd love for you to talk about. One is the power of your personal story and how that really affected him and how it's threaded throughout the book. And then the word outshining.
I often just start telling my story by saying I wanted three things as a kid. One, I wanted to be both Bruce Springsteen and Wonder Woman at the same time somehow. And I also was really curious about the capital T truth in life and what lied beyond just kind of the cyclical stuff I saw going around me, the cycles of abuse, quite frankly, that I saw going on around me. And because of exposure to some things, I also really wanted to die. I found myself having suicidal ideation before I even had that term around the age of 8. And those 3 threads really have been my whole life. Surprisingly enough, when I look back now, it's kind of uncanny that music has become, it's really part of the centerpiece of my world. I guess the superhero thing too, because of acting as a trauma therapist. Um, but also, my run-ins with trauma and violence and alienation and humiliation, um, emotional violence, uh, that really increased as well and developed over my lifespan also, and spun out of control, to the point that I was shooting $150 worth of heroin at rock bottom and getting increasingly desperate at the edge of homelessness. Thankfully had a partner who saved me from that, but, time came when she was fed up with my shit too. And on the side of that, I also was exploring spirituality in a very deep way. Strangely enough, I really thought for a little while in my deluded 20-something mind, like, these 2 things go together. They're both about getting high, right? They're both about, like, changing your experience of the world. And I loved drugs because they put me in control of my reality. And all I'd really had, especially in adult life, was chaos. And so, people do drugs for one of 2 reasons, either to get control of how they feel or to be able to feel something, right? And so for me, it was like, okay, now this depression doesn't own me. Now this fierce rage doesn't own me. I can cool out with X, Y, or Z substance, It really wasn't just heroin for me. It was literally anything I could get my ever loving hands on. Um, so so both of those things just kind of flourished in my life simultaneously until things started falling apart in my life. My dad died. Um, a woman OD'd sleeping next to me. A dear friend and singer in a band that I was in died, all within like a 5-month time frame. And what did I turn to in that moment? What tools did I really have? Because I had explored a spirituality in both the Christian and the Hindu contexts up until that point that carried a message of, listen, what the spiritual life is about is your old self dies and you take on a new self. You are reborn. And that's the old you. The past is gone. Just let that go. Just pray it away. Just chant your mantra and it's going to be fine. And because you're now this new person. And I had a Sanskrit name and everything, that view of spirituality fundamentally will not work for trauma survivors. I needed a spirituality that said, here's your pain. Here's the products of the past in your present time life. How do you meet that? How do you befriend that? How do you learn how to walk the earth as a simple human being before you reach for the stars? I was just caught up in reaching for the stars. So I had no tools when disaster struck. And so I went deeper with drugs. That side of me won out, and things got so bad until I found myself in a 6-month residential treatment facility that was publicly funded by the state of California, and found myself hanging out with the most beautiful humans, all of which were straight from the penitentiary, and found myself, at this real turning point where thankfully I found that kind of spirituality I mentioned before. I found Buddhist somatically based, breath based meditation where up until then I was used to, mantras and pujas, worship ceremonies with candles and incense and deities and gold and fanciful things. And here was a spirituality that was like, nah, we're not doing any of that. Sit down, go inside. What's there? Can you breathe with it? Can you befriend it? And the answer right out the gate was, hell no, I can't. And also WTF with that, like that's intriguing. That's compelling to me. I cannot just be with myself. That, that was revolutionary to me at that time. And so thankfully, these became the new threads of, kind of what had been going on before. Buddhist meditation really took root in my life in a very powerful way. I had a trauma therapist in rehab that was thankfully a somatic experiencing and Haikomi practitioner, was able to do really deep work with her. And when I got out and relapsed again, unfortunately, but then I moved myself to New York City where I didn't know where to get drugs. I had to do it geographically. And suddenly I found myself like, oh my God, I'm in my 30s. I'm happy. I'm sane. What do I do now? I didn't really plan on making it this far, you know? And instantly, it's like, Andrew Harvey, author of the book Spiritual Activism, says, follow your heartbreak. Like, don't follow your heart. Follow, in terms of your life's purpose and what you're here to do, look to what broke you. And there's where you belong. There's where your service belongs. There's where your intelligence and your insider knowledge and, soft skills that no one can train you in, that's where it belongs. And so it was like, boom, trauma therapist, meditation teacher, yoga teacher. That's what I'm going to go for. High school dropout with absolutely no money. And I don't know, like, I was a broke social worker working in the child welfare system in New York City and I had a well-kept secret of a weekly meditation class at a little yoga studio in Brooklyn. And all of a sudden, I don't know, book deals started showing up in my inbox and invitations to teach at places like Spirit Rock and Omega and Kripalu started showing up. And so I don't know how I really got here in terms of who I get to be today and the seat that I get to hold, but just very grateful, very, very grateful.
What do you say to people that will say, the trauma that I know is so bad, I don't wanna go in, I can't go inside, I can't be with myself. I have to keep, all those parts have to keep active, right? All those firefighter parts have to keep, whether it's drugs or food or sex or shopping or working or perfectionism, like all those parts have to keep doing their jobs. So what would you say to people that are like, nope, I can't go inside?
Yeah, I would say that makes a lot of sense. Inside is a haunted house and not a fun one like you find at Halloween, you know? It's a real one. There's lots of ghosts in there. And so of course you don't. Of course you don't. But can we honor this simply as your starting point? I mean, I'm grateful for the IFS model that says, no, those defenses aren't neurotic. They're not to be pathologized. They're not you standing in your own way, which I think is an absolute BS myth that we could ever do that. No creature in nature stands in their own way. They won't make it. So our parts aren't standing in our way. They're standing for us in a confused way.
That's beautiful.
Yeah, which one feels the most rigid about all of this? Let's hang out with that part, you know?
I like
Yeah.
it. That's really good. I was telling you earlier, I love the way your book is set up. And um, one of the kind of boxes that stands out to me was, oh, it was a journal prompt, and it says this goes back to what you were saying earlier. Why are healing and spirituality so closely associated with each other? And so there you were doing drugs, right? Your parts were trying to deal with your pain, and your other parts were trying to deal with your pain through spirituality. Like both were happening at the same time. So can you talk a little bit about that? And what's the answer?
Well, I don't want to spoil the surprise. You got to do the journal prompt. I'll spoil the surprise. Yeah, so there is that view in some spiritual circles of old self versus new self, and you just put the old self away. I wish it worked that way, Tammy. I wish it worked that way. Doesn't work that way. Then we have a different model, what I would say is a trauma-focused model of spirituality. This view, like Rumi said, right? Like ours is not to seek for love, but rather to find and remove the barriers that we've built inside to it. Right. So what happens if like great first question to ask oneself or to ask maybe for a therapist out there, a therapy client on first session is, what would you do if none of this was in your way? We get so caught up on what our problems are, we kind of forget to contemplate what we actually want, what the end game would look like, right? And from a Buddhist lens, our mental afflictions and the cyclical patterns that they drive us down to, right? Our parts being stuck in their habits. That's what's actually in our way. That's the barriers to our deeper nature. And that's the IFS lens too, right? So it's kind of like a subtraction model of spirituality of like, can you use your heart to meet your afflictions, your wounds, dissolve those afflictions, and gain more access to your heart? And then let that be like kind of a snowball effect until all you're left with is that heart of compassion. It's that self energy, Buddha nature, whatever you want to call
Mm, I
it. I
love
think
that.
that's where the correlation is.
Yeah. I have a part that says, I wish I want to be a monk and I want to go just like we were talking about Kripalu earlier. So I want to be a monk at Kripalu and just live there and like meditate all the time. And then, I have other parts that are like, "Well, there's too much to do. Like, we're too busy." And it's like, you can't even, meditate 10 minutes today. Right. So it's like, okay, well, I can't meditate 10 minutes today. So I need to just go be a monk. And then, so it's interesting. I feel it's like I have these polarizations of these parts that are like, what's in my way from being a monk, which I'm putting in quotes, or, meditating is these parts that are so busy, right? And which is so much part of my identity and who I am. Um, and so it's so interesting just to ask that question, sort of like what's in my way. And it's like, oh, these sweet parts that I love so much and do so much for me, they're also the thing that's sort of in the way. I wouldn't say it that way either, but it's interesting to think about that.
Right. I mean, I think the number one obstacle in meditation for most folks is our taskmaster manager that's running the list of all the things we need to keep track of and better not forget. And then the 3 emails in your inbox that you totally left unattended that you didn't even think about until the moment you sat down to meditate, right? I look at those parts as like, like imagine you're cooking maybe Thanksgiving dinner or something, and you've got some kids running around the house and they want to be helpful, but they're little kids. Like you're not going to hand them the knife to chop the vegetables, whatever, like whatever they do to help might kind of be in your way, but you also kind of want to honor their request and give them something to do. And just like that, I'll say to those parts inside, my taskmaster part, great. Thank you. Thank you for all of that. I'm glad you're holding this for me. Could you do me a huge favor and hold that for 20 minutes
Mm.
and remind me? I promise I'll pay attention when you remind me the moment this meditation is done. You know,
What just came up
yeah.
for me is like, I'm gonna hand it the whisk and be like, "Go play drums with the whisk for 20 minutes, and then bring me the whisk back, and then we'll wash it, and then you can help me make mashed potatoes."
I love that image a lot. Yeah.
So the other thing I wanted to ask you about is, well, let's go back to The Shining. So we let's go back to Outshining. Why pick that word? Why was that word so important to you?
I don't know. I mean, is it, Tammy, how do you experience self energy inside? I'm going to interview the interviewer if that's okay for a moment.
Yeah,
What's it like for you?
yeah, so 2 things. One is I feel my face feels softer. I feel more it feels like my whole face relaxes, and I feel a lot of room and space in my chest. I feel like an open, like super open-hearted, and I often think of the sun shining on me. I love the sun. So the sun shining on me, the rays of the sun, and sometimes I even imagine my parts just sort of being in the sun, the warmth and the light. So that's how I experience it.
Oh, that's beautiful. That's beautiful. One of the core meditations I teach, we actually take sunlight in through the body, right? Through the face and then down through the body to gain access to self. Right. But there's that expansive quality to self, right? There's that expansive quality to self. And it's consistent. we can we can rely on that as being a marker of, which lane we're in. I say it in the book. I think it checks out. Um, I don't like speaking in absolutes, but this is one I feel very strongly about. That trauma narrows, stress narrows. We get tunnel vision, we contract in our bodies, our ideas about things might get rigid or very chaotic, which is a different kind of narrowing, really. But healing expands. When we contact the heart, we feel that expansion inside. And in Tibetan Buddhism, the sun is a metaphor, we could say, a symbol for the dawning of wisdom, the dawning of awakening, right? And when I'm blended with parts that are absolutely not letting go, and suddenly somehow I relax into self, it feels like, if you've ever seen a really good sunrise, watching the sun, peek up over the horizon, and little by little it gets brighter and brighter, and um, it's very akin to that. And so with some wounds, I'm with Dick Schwartz and Frank Anderson and these folks who all say trauma can be healed. And that's revolutionary and not widely accepted even in the conventional psychological world. But there are some things that might stick around for a very long time, or we might retain the infrastructure around because it's so deep, especially with CPTSD and attachment injuries. But one thing I've learned from direct experience of self is that it can expand to be bigger than any level of heartache, any sense of brokenness, any sense of wounding, no matter how deep, no matter how wide, no matter how big. Self energy can expand to fill the entire room you're sitting in. If you practice with it, and your parts begin to trust it. So even if you feel totally stuck with whatever's going on, that heart inside of us can expand to meet it, become bigger than it.
I love that, and I love the idea of scaffolding, that it's like parts and this makes sense, that
Mhm.
and we know this about brain science too, which I know that you talk about, is that there's my parts have created the scaffolding, and then I have the wiring that supports that, and the scaffolding is like, "Okay, so when this happens, this is what we do, and then this is what happens, this is what we do, and this happens, this is what we do." And then when we're 50 years old, that scaffolding's pretty like, it's stuck in cement, that scaffolding's pretty stuck there. And so what I'm hearing you say is we can, be with those parts, but those parts might need more time with self or more to feel self more with a practice of self.
Yeah, I think about it as stains, really, right? Like if you spilled coffee on a shirt today and you went and dealt with it right away, chances are you're going to get the stain out. But if it's at for 50 years, right? It's going to be real hard to get that residue out. But either way, the solution is kind of the same. You put them both in the sun. Right.
Mm,
Put them both in the
wow.
sun, and the difference is just how long that's gonna take, that natural bleaching process, right?
I love it. And so, would you say the sun practices or the practices of putting our stains in the sun are meditations you have in your book and journal entries in your book? Like, would you say those are the type of practices of putting our stains in the sun?
Absolutely, and any IFS-based thing has this emphasis, right, on, like, how does self-energy meet with parts holding burdens? That's the healing formula. There's a famous Buddhist teacher who once said, "Place the heart of fearfulness in the cradle of loving kindness." And the first time I heard that, I was like, "Yo, that's a meditation instruction."
It's
Place the heart
beautiful.
of fearfulness in the cradle of loving kindness. That's self-energy meeting apart,
Mm.
right? That's exactly what we're doing. And so the book is really, we start from the very beginning of like, let's establish a doable meditation practice for you. Let's get a, grip on what parts are and how they behave and how to regard them, how to get in touch with them. And we progress all the way up to the the more refined stages of IFS and unburdening retrieval and what have you, and get into some really deep topics towards the end of the book. But along the way, essentially, the book is a training in how to access parts work in meditation, which is a little different than IFS therapy. I did it on myself as a meditator, which was really how I learned the model, was through self-practice. Um, but that's also a little bit of a different animal. For one, it's free, and you can do it every day if you need to. You can do it anytime, anywhere. And so I really appreciate those aspects of the approach of parts work meditation. But also, I'll just say this much. One key difference between parts work in a facilitated context, such as a therapy or coaching session, versus the DIY approach on your meditation cushion or meditation chair, as the case may be, meditation sofa perhaps, is actually that sunlight, and knowing what that sunlight is, having a reference point, being able to find your way there to self-energy is of pivotal importance. It becomes even more important. And so a lot of my practices that I teach, really we begin with self, as opposed to in a therapeutic context, you probably begin with the part, the presenting problem, right? But in my classes, we begin with like, okay, how do you recognize when self-energy is present? And what can we look to in the world around us that gives us clues, such as the earth, such as the sun, such as breath, the way that the breath regulates us is this healthy influence, delivers nutrients to our cells. I would say that the essence of self-energy is in the breath, actually. So we start to internalize first, the cradle of loving kindness, and then we put the heart of fearfulness in it.
I love that. I love that. And I feel like I'm hearing that more and more is um of yeah, like having that firm cradle. Right, like, we would not put the baby in the cradle if we had not tested the cradle to make sure that it was firm, like, so I really love this idea, and I think it also keeps us from just doing parts work, which I think that a lot of people, when they're beginning IFS, like, I do consultation, and so I'll be like, "Okay, well, where was self, or where were you, or where was the client?" Like, there's still no like, we're talking to parts, which is great, right? You're talking to parts, and you're getting a lot of information, but can you build that relationship with them, right? So that's sometimes the piece that I think gets missed, and so I love with starting with self, so that you're giving the clients, you're giving yourself, whether you're meditating, however we're doing this, you're giving yourself an experience that a redo. We're giving ourselves this thing that we didn't get as kids often, and in the same way, like we didn't get it in this way. That's really
Yeah.
beautiful.
Yep. Yep. And we have it now in the most reliable format that it's ever existed in,
Mm,
right?
mhm.
Like, yeah, it's right there in your back
Yeah.
pocket, you know?
Yeah, that's beautiful. Well, I am super excited about this book and about just introducing you to the IFS community. This is really great, Ralph. How can people find out more about you and get your book and your meditations and your courses? You have so much to offer.
Yeah. So ralphdelarosa.com would be the hub, and then Ralph De La Rosa on Instagram or TikTok. And then I'm also, I don't know, on Insight Timer, on YouTube, on SoundCloud. It's all over the place. I'm pretty Googleable, but I would say that Outshining Trauma is actually a really, really wonderful place to start. I felt writing it like this is the book I needed to be writing all along. And definitely the clearest kind of handbook style work presented that I've done to date. So, great place to start. Dozens of meditations and practices in there as well. So,
Yeah, yeah, I loved it, and I was telling you before we hit record that it was fantastic, and I wanna go back through it slower and more, like, personal, not just sort of like, "Oh my gosh, this is really good." Like, so yeah, really great, Ralph. So last question, if you weren't doing all the things that you have to do and having to move and all the things that you have going on in your life, and you could do anything that you wanted, what would you do?
music, music, no brainer. I have a song in my head all day. It's always what I'm looking to turn to when nothing else is going on. It feeds me. It gives me a place to put all my anger. It gives my parts. Yeah, just so much space to be free in a place of free expression. I think of music as my escape from work, but then it always turns into my work too, because singing um, is both deeply therapeutic, but also will take you on a path of trauma recovery too, because what comes up when we use our voice in a loud context, what gets nervous, what gets scared, what contracts, has been a real field of discovery for me. And learning to, one parts work thing about music is, you want emotion to be in the mix, but not too much because you'll lose technique. But if emotion isn't there, you're a robot. And so it's really taught me how to hold parts in a particular way where they're informing my experience, but not taking over.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's beautiful. That's beautiful. Thank you, Ralph. This was great.
Yeah. Likewise. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for hanging out with us today. If you enjoyed this episode, I'd love it if you left a rating, a review, a like, comment, share with your family, your friends. That would mean so much to me. My book is available at your favorite independent bookstore or on Amazon. You can visit my website, tammysallenberger.com, or you can download a free Get to Know a Should part of you. You can follow me at IFS Tammy on Instagram and at The One Inside on Facebook and on YouTube. Jeff Schrum co-produces The One Inside, and I am forever grateful for Jeff. Also thankful for Jack Reardon for creating the music, and just thank you for listening. 6 seasons, over 1 million downloads. I cannot tell you how much I appreciate you in this community. I'll see you next time.